Hello and welcome, Exiles, to my look at Explosive Concoction Pathfinder. I've been playing this character for a few days, and I wanted to put together a planner for those of you interested in following the character, as well as a bit of my thoughts on what's good, what's bad, and in between. Now, to start off with, I made a leveling tree all the way from first lab, second, third, fourth to the current tree. So if you're curious of following it all the way through the campaign, straight up the first time you get your first lab and you click the concoction skill, you can play Concoction all the way through the campaign. Probably my favorite part of the Concoction skills is they're very strong from the start, and it's just super smooth all the way through the campaign. All you really need to do the campaign at a pretty easy, meager fashion is simply a widowhail and a +1 quiver for, when you swap over. And then when you get to level 32, buy a +2 quiver. You can search the level requirement and you can force it to be level 32. Just only look for +2 stat. You don't necessarily need any other stats to go with it. And then later on, you'll get a bit better quiver at a higher level with higher level stats. But that should be plenty to cruise through the campaign, and it goes quite well, I would say. So those are the leveling trees for those curious. As well as I put together some gem link setups to give you an idea of what to use here. I will say you'll notice there's a cast on Ignite with Eye of Winter, and there's an Eye of Winter setup. These are redundant. Basically, it's one or the other. Essentially, my character has an expensive jewel, which is a Spirit Against Darkness. If you look at this tree, I have a Spirit Against Darkness. This is probably going to be more expensive than most people would like to pay. And quite frankly, all it's giving us access to is Cast on Ignite, Eye of Winter. And ultimately, it's only really proccing on the boss when I remember to click my mana flask. We spend way more mana on this than is necessary. It isn't really helping our clear. So I wanted to include, you can just self-cast the Eye of Winter when you get to a boss. It's basically flammability, Eye of Winter, and then start chucking flasks. The reason for that is concoction skills don't have good base crit, or at least the explosive concoction does not have good base crit. And Eye of Winter gives you 10 base crit, which then makes all of the crit chance we have on our tree a lot more powerful, and that's what that's doing. Outside of that, the other reservations we have is Ghost Dance and Wind Dancer. This is just a good combination of high evasion scaling for we're using the Queen of the Forest to go fast, and then Ghost Dance to help us sustain our ES when we take a hit. All that high evasion gives us back a lot of ES when we get hit. And then Alchemist Boon for our Mana Flask sustain, along with a little bit of boosted recovery to our Life Flask with Herbalism, so that way we can sustain our ES. We are doing Eternal Youth with a bit of a hybrid ES setup for survivability on the character. So that's the gem setup. Honestly, right now, if you're wondering for the showcase, at level 89, a lot of times I get asked about this, is what levels do you get links for the explosive concoction? Right now I have a 5 link. When I hit level 90, I will get a 6 link. And on top of that, if you're, I think it's around level, I want to say 40-ish that you get your 4th link, and around 65 to 70-ish is when you get your 5 link. So those are roughly the breakpoints. It starts out as a 3 link, which is completely fine. But then as you level up, you'll get more links. So that's currently the idea. As you level up, you'll get more links to the character. All right. Anyways, that goes over that. One other thing I want to attest is I have a campaign kit, which is basically the gear I use while leveling through the campaign. You start to get a bit squishy towards Act 4 and onward with this gear. You can upgrade it as you feel necessary. I just kind of bum rushed through the campaign. I died a few times to one-shots with this gear because it's, there's no HP on this gear. It's just about moving fast through the campaign and not really worrying too much. But you can make the decision for yourself. Ultimately, I'd recommend at least by around 65 to 70-ish, you want to start looking at more powerful gear upgrades for what your, actual like rares and stuff. Because your survivability starts to get a bit sketch later on in the campaign. But this should get you through most of the campaign. Just wanted to give you some content, or some context there, rather. Anyway, so that's some of the basics of the character. As for what I've given you to get yourself some items, I have a weighted sum search for a +2 quiver, as well as some basic searches for gloves, boots, and helmets. And why am I doing this? This is essentially because the most important thing about this character for these 3 gear slots is it's all about helping us stack evasion. We are playing a Queen of the Forest build, which means we want to scale evasion pretty high. And I think the best compromise where you can still get some decent EHP as well as some good evasion is going a pure evasion boots, hybrid ES evasion gloves, and then pure ES helmet. Why is that? With our tree, there is a node that gives you 2 evasion per 1 ES. If you're going to go a pure evasion helmet on the high end, you can get around 1500 roughly evasion with it, like all T1 affixes and corrupted on an extra socket, versus a pure ES helmet, you could probably get close to 600, which gives you 1200 evasion. But the benefit here is you get a lot of raw EHP. Most of our ES is coming from our helmet. If you look at this, 2000 of our 2600 is coming from our helmet. The idea here is it allows us to get a bit better EHP pool, even though I have scuffed gear that doesn't have much life on it. For example, ideally, if we're min-maxing this character, we'd like to have 2 rings with life on it. That would get us much closer to like 1700, 1800 life. But I couldn't really afford rings that good, so I didn't have that. And this helps us supplement our low HP pool with getting a high ES helmet. That's the thought process there of going the subterfuge mask node, and why I'm recommending doing a high ES helmet. And then for boots, pure evasion, and for gloves, hybrid. That's what I sort of settled on. If you want to go min-max into movement speed, you can go pure evasion for all 3, but keep in mind you will be much squishier. Losing that ES, in my opinion, I don't think is worth it. Outside of that, as for the widowhail, there's a breakpoint at 270%. You get about 80% from the nodes on the tree, and that 270% means that 80 plus 270 takes you to 350, which gives you a 4.5 multiplier on the +2 number, which takes you to 9 gem levels from your quiver, scaling your overall base damage of Explosive Concoction. Explosive Concoction scales twice per level. It gets both effectiveness as well as flat damage, which makes it fairly good at scaling when you add extra gem levels. Each gem level makes quite a big difference. For context, the difference in about 3 levels, from what I could tell, is around 70% more damage. So keep in mind, gem levels are very important. The more you can get in, the better. Speaking of gem levels, part of the reason I chose to do Explosive Concoction over the other concoction skills was essentially due to the fact that I had gotten a little bit hooked on, let me just open this from here. I'd gotten a little bit hooked on gambling Fireflowers. This was for a previous character, but I found out that you can actually get a +6 from Fireflower. And the way this works is if you corrupt it, it will hit a +4 roll and put a multiplier on it. If that positive multiplier on the Fireflower goes from 4 to at least 4.5, it will round up to 5, and then 20 quality will take it from 5 to 6. So you'll notice there's there's one +6 on the market right now, and then there's a +5. Every time you see a +5 on the market, just know that if this had fire quality on it, this amulet would say +6 on it. It's a very unfortunate thing where quality catalysts for fire cost, they're basically free. Catalysts are like, there's way more in the market than anyone needs. So if you're ever thinking about corrupting these, you definitely want to quality it. Another thing I want to say about quality or corrupting the Fireflower is you do not need to corrupt a +4 amulet. The Valorb option, when you corrupt them, it has a 1 in 4 chance to hit the outcome where it's going to be a multiplier, but that outcome will divine the amulet first and then apply the multiplier. So you have the same chance to hit a +6 Fireflower with a Fireflower that starts out as a +1 versus one that starts out as a +4. It does not matter. So what I did is I had bought a bunch of cheap Fireflowers for about 20 to 30x each. I bought 60 of them, corrupted a bunch, and eventually I hit the plus level 1 out of the 60 ones I corrupted. I think my math, based on what I've come to the conclusion of, which is roughly you have 1 in 4 Valorbs that will divine the item. 1 in 4 of those will give you a +4 outcome. So roughly 1 in 16 will hit a +4 amulet. And then of those 16, you then need to hit a multiplier that I believe is roughly about, I want to say, a 1.13 to get it above the 4.5 mark to round up, which is roughly about it's a little bit worse than 1 in 4. So I think the amulet corruption is somewhere in the range of 60 to 80 on average to get 1 +6. You can check my math on that, but I think that's roughly around how it works. As for how necessary this is, to get the damage you see in this video, I am a level 89 Pathfinder. I did this intentionally because number one, it means we are down one socket, so we're missing damage from a socket. And number two, we are missing damage from every time you hit the breakpoint for the level, your skill levels up. This skill level you have right here, you'll see it's a level 35 skill. I am missing a level. When I hit level 90, it will level from 19 to 20. So hopefully this gives you some level of confidence that if you play this build, you do not need a +6 Fireflower to get what you've seen in this video, because I am missing a damage support and I'm missing the level I will get when I level to 90. I just wanted to preface that it's not mandatory. It is a luxury upgrade. It's something where I wanted to corrupt a bunch of Fireflowers. I hit a +6 and then I went to myself, okay, what fire skills are out there that I could try to use this amulet and enjoy with it? I settled on doing Fireflower. Ultimately, you can just do a +4 Fireflower, or you can use a +3 amulet with some other good stats on it, and the build will work pretty fine in my opinion. It's kind of overkill damage. I'd imagine Concoction skills might be on the trajectory of something that may be balanced down in terms of power level because of how good it is with level scaling. Another thing I want to address is people have asked me about widowhail and is it meant to work with this? From my interpretation of the skill, which if you look at the skill, it says, look at it in the passive tree, will it say? I guess it'll let me do it if I do this. Okay. It says specifically, consume charges from your mana flask to throw a bottle that explodes, dealing unarmed fire attack damage. Dealing unarmed fire attack damage. Now, I want to preface, there's nothing on there stating you cannot use a bow, or you cannot use a quiver, or you have to be unarmed. Nothing says you have to be unarmed. It says you deal unarmed damage. And specifically, what I believe that means is most likely the % increased damage with bows will not apply in the future. Maybe that's something they'll patch out. But everything else with widowhail, the attack speed scaling, the crit chance scaling, crit damage scaling, +2 proj, all that stuff, that works exactly how it should. The +2 levels should be applying. And when they change the skill, if they change the skill to make the bow damage not apply, I believe the skill will still be quite strong. We will be losing from this change when they change the 29% to not work. We have about 400% quiver effect. We will be losing 150% increased damage if that is something they change. I just want to preface that. Which means we will be more inclined to grab nodes like this, which have % damage, as well as nodes like this. And on top of that, you can potentially even sidestep this nerf. For example, you'll see my quiver here has bow damage. Well, there is a quiver corruption that can occur. It might be something we go for in the future, which is just generic increased damage that can occur as a quiver corruption. You'll see this 27% damage corruption. There's 1,000 quivers online that have this. As for quivers that have +2 in this, I don't know. That might be more of the limiting factor, but I'd like to say I think there's enough damage or enough meat on the bone, so to speak, that if this is bugged, which I think 90% chance the bow skills probably shouldn't be applying to Concoction because it's not a bow skill. If it gets nerfed, I still think it's going to be plenty strong of a skill. I don't think they'd want to make Concoction skills completely irrelevant, and I just don't think that'd be enough of a nerf anyways, because I already think they're kind of overpowered in terms of gem level damage scaling. Excuse me, sorry. I apologize. I am quite sick. Okay. Anywho, that goes over some of the basics of the character, why we have the amulet, and we have a bit of weighted sums. I will say one thing about the gloves, boots, and helmet search. All of these searches that I set up for these 3 items, I am doing a search with not rune increase armor evasion. Why am I doing this? It's specifically to highlight boots that have not been socketed and have not been placed runes on them. So that way, ideally, you can get something pretty high value in terms of evasion number without paying a premium price. For example, this is 780 evasion and it's 5 divines. Then there's this one for 765, which is 30x. Now, what happens when I take these boots and I 20 quality them? Well, this will go to like 900 something plus, and I put in an evasion rune in it. It'll get probably close to 1,000. Now, compare this if I take away this stat, and you aren't looking for the boots this way, and I say I hover over to evasion. You'll say I search by evasion here. Oh, there's some for 4 divines, so I guess, but here's an example. 990, which is probably close to what that pair of boots we saw would get to, is at 2 divines, 3 divines, 2 divines. I guess I could try to check Exalt price here to see the best which you could get for Exalt price. Yeah, and it's this pair right here, which if I bought this and put in a rune and qualityed it up, it'd be similar to those 2 divine pairs at a fraction of the cost. So that's why I set up the search this way. Ultimately, when enough people use this search, these will start to balance out to be a similar price to the ones that already have runes socketed in them. But you can manually change that yourself if you want to, simply by clicking this button here, whether or not you want the not rune search to be a part of the search. That's what that's for. The most important stats for the character with those gear slots is these is just high evasion hybrid ES, and then high ES. So that's what those are for. And then ultimately you're kind of trying to basically fix your res with your rings and your belt is the idea. Okay, outside of all of those options, I want to address the two other big elephants in the room in terms of expense for the character, because these are the other premium items we have. Number 1 is the heroic tragedy, and number 2 is the adorned jewel. What I would say to you is, if you want to play concoction skills on a budget and you were wondering, will the build work on a budget? I have 2 very big changes that will take out all the costs. Well, technically 3 if you include adorned, but I just want to showcase right here the idea I would recommend. If you want to do this on a budget, I would say let go of heroic tragedy, which you'll see our evasion goes from, it was at 38k to 27k. And on top of that, 1, I wouldn't do adorned. This is not necessary for damage. It's just more of a min-max thing. And number 3, I would let go of Queen of the Forest. I would just do boots, which have regular movement speed. I would get a little bit more well-rounded defensively. That means you can maybe have an ES chest piece or an ES evasion chest piece hybrid, and you can make that work quite well for a fairly high survivability character. You will just lose out on the movement speed. It's a bit of a min-maxing thing. Ultimately, the movement speed is just something that's a feels-good option to make you farm faster. Is it necessary for whether or not the build is viable or not for endgame bosses? Absolutely not. Don't let it control what you can and cannot play, because largely a good amount of the expense of this character is completely contingent on Queen of the Forest, which is like an 8D, 90 item, Heroic Tragedy, which I believe when I bought this jewel was like 20D, and then Adorned, which is just simply not necessary. You could easily replace this jewel with a rare, this jewel with a rare. This jewel, you get rid of the Spirit mod and it becomes a 1 divine jewel, and then you would get rid of these extra points. Well, you would keep this one and just do a rare jewel there, but then you'd get rid of these extra points and you'd start spiking them for evasion energy shield, and you would just get a largely tankier character that just doesn't move with 90 movement speed and moves with 30 instead, because you have 30 movement speed boots. Hopefully that makes some level of sense. As for the Adorned jewel, specifically why are we using it, and something I haven't addressed in the build, you'll notice I have jewels which are time lost jewels specifically, and I'm using them with Adorned because number 1, it min-maxes the notable scaling pretty well. But aside from doing that, if we were just do a rare jewel, you could get these things as rares that have, I guess, potentially extra stats. Instead of magnitude and crit chance, you could get magnitude, crit chance, crit damage bonus, and maybe evasion or some other stat is what you could do if you don't want to do Adorned, because Adorned is quite a bit more expensive. And all that would change is this would change from saying 80% attack speed, 20% magnitude, 7 crit, to 8% attack speed, 20% magnitude, 7 crit, and then it would say crit multi, and then it would say evasion or whatever stat you have on this. Maybe it would say ES on some of the small nodes, whatever it is, that depends on how you're making the character. But the idea for time lost jewels is simply that if you have 3 or more notables, then they're better than rares 1-to-1. The notable stats where it says notable passives have, those are 1-to-1 stats that occur on regular jewels, and typically they're roughly about half the value that you would see on a rare jewel. The one exception to this is the stat we're using, the magnitude of damaging ailments. That stat occurs up to 20% on a regular jewel, and it's 20% per notable on a time lost jewel. I think it's just a numerically error GGG made. They forgot to cut it in half. I would have expected this stat to say 10%, but I think it's a bit of a oversight on their end, and we're going to use it because it helps scaling our Ignite. Speaking of our Ignite, and speaking of the concoction skills as a whole, I gotta be honest, I don't really feel the concoction skills are all that different. They all have very similar base damage. Specifically, lightning has a bit higher than the rest. Then fire and bleeding have a bit higher than poison and cold. Like slightly, like 20% differences. Like fire's maybe 20% higher base damage than cold and poison. And lightning's 20% higher than fire. So there is a bit of a base damage difference, but ultimately they don't feel too different to me. It's basically just stack some gem levels, stack some attack speed, stack some crit, stack some percent damage scaling, and then you're changing the color at which you're blowing up the enemy for the most part. The main thing that changes is freezing concoctions can scale a bit better, a bit more easily into crit or shattering concoction. Poisonous concoction can get actually like decent clear because it can do poison prolifs and stuff. And then lightning maybe can have your highest damage scaling late game because you can use shock, which is better damage scaling. And then for bleeding and fire concoction or explosive concoction, you get the ability to go into bleed or ignite. Now, specifically, I tried going into ignite because I have the 100% ignite magnitude, and I have on my tree over 200% magnitude ailment effect between this jewel and this jewel. And from my experience, even with 200% ailment or magnitude of the ailment, along with the 100% more magnitude of ignite that comes with the explosive concoction, ultimately, the entire time I was playing this character, I could go inflict an ignite and it would be doing decent damage. I tried to showcase it in the clips by not just full spamming the flask and just insta-wiping the enemy, but it wasn't particularly relevant in the overarching picture. We dealt so much hit-based damage. It was so easy to put on the +2 proj and then shotgun for 3 hits every single throw that it didn't really feel that beneficial to say, oh, let's pretend we're doing ignite damage because the hit damage was already so much. I'm not sure if I'm making sense. My conclusion essentially is I am not convinced that ignite has enough base damage to be particularly relevant in a skill that you can spam attack. I think it makes more sense, or it makes like it, the only scenario I see it making some level of sense is something like Hammer of the Gods or Flame Blast, where you have some more significant charge up time to inflict it, to snapshot that damage over a period of time and let the ignite actually deal out. For Concoction, it's too easy to get some decent attack speed, and you get the +2 proj, and all of a sudden the ignite damage is just a lot less relevant to how fast you're killing the enemy. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but yeah. So the TLDR from Concoction skills is, I'm not sure ignite's worth it. I feel like maybe I could just scale into a bit more hit-based damage, and that might be the play. So I'm gonna probably test that out. The thing I will say is the advantage that I have with the fire skill is I have 3 more gem levels than you'd get with any other skill because of this amulet. Now, technically other skills, like for example, cold could get +1 cold here, chaos can get +1 chaos here. You have to change your tree around, so they have that counterpoint. I'm not sure I'm a big fan of altering the tree that significantly, so I still like the plus levels of Fireflower, but it is something to consider. So anyways, that is a look at the Explosive Concoction Pathfinder I've been working on. I might do one more update with a bit more filled out planner, and maybe, depending on if people like it, I might consider a guide, but I'm not sure I want to put in that level of work or not, depending on what feedback I get and what people think of the build. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed looking at the Explosive Concoction Pathfinder today. As always, thanks for watching, Exiles. Take care and peace out. Have a good one.